October 23, 1935. Palace Chophouse, Newark, New Jersey. A man sat in the back room, counting money while his bodyguards played cards at a nearby table. Outside, 3 men stepped from a black sedan. One carried a sawed-off shotgun beneath his coat. The man counting money had no idea that the most powerful criminals in America had just decided he was worth more dead than alive. His name was Dutch Schultz. Born Arthur Flegenheimer to German Jewish immigrants in the Bronx, he had clawed his way from the gutters of New York to control a criminal empire worth millions. By 1935, he commanded an army of enforcers, ran the most profitable numbers racket in Harlem, and operated speakeasies and beer distribution networks across the Northeast. He had survived gang wars, multiple indictments, and assassination attempts. He had bribed judges, murdered rivals, and built a reputation so fearsome that even hardened criminals whispered his name with caution. But Dutch Schultz had made a fatal miscalculation. He believed he was untouchable. He believed the rules that governed other criminals didn't apply to him. And most dangerously, he believed he could do what no gangster had ever dared: assassinate a United States attorney without consequences. The man he wanted dead was Thomas Dewey, a 33-year-old prosecutor who had made it his mission to dismantle organized crime in New York City. Dewey was methodical, incorruptible, and effective. His investigations had already sent dozens of racketeers to prison. Now he was closing in on Schultz's most profitable operations, threatening to destroy everything the gangster had built. Schultz's solution was simple, direct, and absolutely insane: kill Dewey before Dewey could bring him down. The other mob bosses, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and the men who ran the National Crime Syndicate, were horrified. Killing a prosecutor would bring the full weight of federal law enforcement down on every criminal operation in the country. It would shatter the delicate balance they had spent years constructing, the careful system of bribes and political connections that allowed them to operate with relative impunity. They had tried reasoning with Schultz. They had tried threatening him. Nothing worked. So they made their decision in a hotel suite in Midtown Manhattan, voting as if they were corporate executives deciding to eliminate a troublesome competitor. The vote was unanimous. Dutch Schultz had to die. This is the story of a gangster who refused to recognize limits, who believed his will was stronger than the collective power of organized crime itself. It's a story of ambition twisted into paranoia, of wealth that couldn't buy wisdom, and of a man who broke the one rule that the criminal underworld held sacred: never bring heat on the entire organization for personal reasons. The men walking into the Palace Chophouse that October evening weren't there to negotiate. They were there to deliver the Syndicate's judgment. In less than 2 minutes, bullets would fly, men would fall, and one of the most notorious gangsters in American history would begin a slow, agonizing death. But his real destruction had begun weeks earlier, the moment he decided he was more important than the mob itself. The beer baron of the Bronx, the policy king of Harlem, the man who thought he could defy the most powerful criminal organization ever assembled. Dutch Schultz was about to learn that in the underworld, even the most ruthless individuals were expendable when they threatened the survival of the whole. August 6, 1902, Bronx, New York. Emma Noy Flegenheimer gave birth to a boy in a cramped tenement apartment. She named him Arthur. The Bronx streets where Arthur grew up were a crucible of poverty, violence, and desperation. His father, Herman Flegenheimer, was a saloon keeper who abandoned the family when Arthur was 14, leaving Emma to raise 2 children alone in one of the poorest neighborhoods in New York. Arthur Flegenheimer's transformation into Dutch Schultz began in those streets. He dropped out of school after 8th grade and immediately fell in with the street gangs that controlled the neighborhood. The gangs offered what his fractured family couldn't: structure, income, and a sense of belonging. Arthur was slight, wiry, and possessed of a hair-trigger temper that made him dangerous despite his small stature. When someone insulted him, he didn't argue. He attacked with whatever was at hand: fists, bottles, brass knuckles, anything that could inflict damage. His first arrest came at 17, burglary. He served 15 months at Blackwell's Island, where he learned more about crime than any street gang could have taught him. Inside, he met safecrackers, armed robbers, and experienced bootleggers. When he emerged in 1920, prohibition had just become law. The entire nation had just criminalized alcohol, creating the most lucrative black market in American history. Arthur Flegenheimer saw his opportunity. He adopted the name Dutch Schultz. Sources vary on the exact origin, but most historians believe he took it from a deceased member of the old Frog Hollow Gang, a crew of Bronx street toughs. The name sounded tougher than Arthur Flegenheimer, more intimidating, more German-American working class. It was a calculated piece of branding for the criminal marketplace. Dutch started small, running beer for established bootleggers, hijacking rival shipments, and building a reputation as someone who would do anything for money. He was fearless during delivery runs, often riding shotgun with a sawed-off weapon across his lap, daring police or rivals to interfere. When they did, he shot first. His willingness to use violence without hesitation made him valuable. By 1928, Dutch had assembled his own crew. His right-hand man was Bo Weinberg, a brutal enforcer who handled the wet work, the beatings, the murders, the intimidation that kept competitors in line. Joey No, another partner, helped Dutch establish speakeasies in the Bronx. Together, they began muscling into the Bronx beer trade, which was then fragmented among dozens of small operators. Dutch's method was simple. Approach a speakeasy owner and offer protection. If the owner accepted, Dutch's beer came through the door at inflated prices, and the owner paid for the privilege of not being bombed or beaten. If the owner refused, violence followed immediately. Speakeasies that rejected Dutch's offer found their windows smashed, their inventory stolen, their bartenders hospitalized. One owner who particularly resisted received a visit from Bo Weinberg. They found the man later, beaten so severely he never walked properly again. Word spread. Refusals became rare. The beer business was lucrative, but Dutch's real fortune came from the numbers racket. The numbers game was an illegal lottery that flourished in poor neighborhoods, particularly in Harlem. Players bet small amounts, nickels, dimes, quarters, on three-digit numbers. The winning number was determined by various methods, often the last three digits of the day's total betting handle at a racetrack. The odds of winning were roughly 1,000 to 1, but winners received a 600 to 1 payout. The difference was pure profit for the operators. Thousands of people played every day. The business required runners to collect bets, controllers to manage the runners, and bankers to handle the money. It was decentralized, cash-intensive, and generated enormous profits. When Dutch recognized the potential, he began systematically taking over the Harlem numbers operations, one banker at a time. His technique was characteristically brutal. He would identify the most profitable numbers bankers, approach them, and demand a partnership, meaning Dutch would take the majority of profits while the original operators did all the work. When bankers refused, as they often did initially, Dutch's enforcers arrived. They beat the bankers' runners, intimidated their customers, and in some cases, simply murdered the bankers and took over their operations entirely. One particularly successful Harlem numbers operator, Stephanie St. Clair, known as Queenie, resisted fiercely. She was one of the few people who stood up to Schultz publicly, even placing newspaper advertisements warning the community about his extortion. But even St. Clair eventually couldn't withstand the sustained campaign of violence. Dutch's men beat her runners, firebombed her locations, and eventually forced her into an alliance with another mobster for protection. Dutch absorbed much of her operation. By 1931, Dutch Schultz controlled a criminal empire generating an estimated $20 million annually, an astronomical sum during the Depression. He employed hundreds of people directly and thousands indirectly. His organization collected bets from tens of thousands of Harlem residents daily. His beer flowed into speakeasies across the Bronx and Manhattan. His influence reached into police precincts, political clubs, and judicial chambers. He owned judges the way other men owned furniture. But Dutch's relationship with the broader organized crime world was complicated and increasingly tense. The early 1930s saw the rise of the National Crime Syndicate, a loose confederation of major mob families and independent operators who agreed to cooperate rather than compete, to share territories and settle disputes through negotiation rather than warfare. The syndicate was largely the creation of Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, two brilliant criminal strategists who recognized that endless gang warfare was bad for business. Luciano, born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily, had risen through the ranks of the New York Mafia through a combination of ruthlessness and intelligence. In 1931, he had orchestrated the assassination of Joe Masseria, the Old World Mafia boss, effectively ending the Castellamarese War and ushering in a new era of organized crime. Luciano brought modern business practices to the underworld, standardized operations, reduced violence, improved political corruption networks, and cooperative relationships between different ethnic criminal groups. Meyer Lansky, Luciano's closest associate, was a financial genius who understood that the real power in organized crime came from legitimate business fronts, careful accounting, and strategic bribery. Where Luciano handled personnel and territory, Lansky managed money and logistics. Together, they built a structure that would dominate American organized crime for decades. Dutch Schultz participated in syndicate meetings and nominally accepted their authority, but he remained fundamentally independent and unpredictable. He attended the conferences, nodded during the discussions, and then did whatever he wanted. When the syndicate suggested reducing violence to avoid law enforcement attention, Dutch continued murdering rivals. When they recommended sharing territories, Dutch kept expanding. When they emphasized the importance of maintaining low profiles, Dutch flaunted his wealth and power. The other bosses tolerated him because his operations were profitable, and he generally stayed in his own territory. But they watched him carefully, recognizing that Dutch Schultz was precisely the kind of volatile, impulsive gangster who could bring disaster down on everyone. He had the temperament of a street thug despite running an organization worth millions. He couldn't separate personal slights from business decisions. He killed people for disrespecting him when silence would have been more profitable. In May 1933, Dutch's partner Joey No was shot during a robbery, dying of his wounds shortly after. Dutch blamed rival gangsters and responded with a wave of retaliatory violence that left several men dead and brought unwanted police scrutiny. It was exactly the kind of unnecessary escalation that made the syndicate bosses nervous. But Dutch didn't care about their nervousness. He had built his empire through violence and intimidation, and he saw no reason to change tactics. He was making millions. He controlled blocks of Harlem and the Bronx. He had politicians and police on his payroll. Why should he listen to Lucky Luciano or Meyer Lansky about how to run his business? This attitude, this fundamental inability to accept that he was part of a larger structure, would ultimately destroy him. Dutch Schultz believed he was exceptional, that the rules constraining other criminals didn't apply to him. He was about to discover how wrong he was. The numbers racket was perfect for Dutch Schultz's particular talents. It required organization, intimidation, and the kind of street-level violence that came naturally to him. By 1933, his numbers operation in Harlem was processing an estimated $10 million annually. The actual cash flow was staggering. Every day, hundreds of runners collected tens of thousands of individual bets from barbershops, bars, candy stores, and street corners. The money flowed upward through controllers to bankers to Dutch's headquarters, where accountants counted and recorded every dollar. The beauty of the numbers game was its community roots. Unlike bootlegging, which was clearly illegal and opposed by temperance advocates, the numbers racket was simply illegal gambling, something many poor communities saw as harmless entertainment. Players knew the odds were against them, but a nickel bet offered hope, however slim, of a life-changing payout. For people living in poverty during the Depression, that hope was worth the price, but the sheer scale of Dutch's operation made it impossible to hide. Thousands of people were involved. Money changed hands in public. The operation required extensive record-keeping, which meant paper trails, which meant evidence, and the profits were so enormous that politicians and law enforcement couldn't ignore them, especially when reform-minded officials came to power. Enter Thomas Edmund Dewey. In July 1935, New York Governor Herbert Lehman appointed Dewey as a special prosecutor to investigate organized crime in New York City. Dewey was 33 years old, a Republican with political ambitions, and possessed of an unshakable belief in the rule of law. He had grown up in Owasso, Michigan, the son of a newspaper editor, and had come to New York to practice law. He was organized, thorough, and completely immune to the corruption that infected so much of New York's political establishment. Dewey understood that most prosecutors had failed to bring down major gangsters because they focused on individual crimes, a single murder, a single bootlegging operation. Dewey took a different approach. He would build massive cases using accounting records, testimony from lower-level operatives, and careful documentation of entire criminal enterprises. He would prove patterns of criminal activity, conspiracy charges that could send mob bosses away for decades, even if specific violent acts couldn't be proven. His first major target was Dutch Schultz. Dewey knew that Schultz's numbers racket involved hundreds of people, which meant hundreds of potential witnesses. It required extensive financial records, which meant paper evidence. It was so large and so public that proving its existence would be relatively simple. The challenge was building a case that could actually convict Schultz, who had beaten multiple indictments through a combination of witness intimidation, jury tampering, and corrupt judges. Dewey assembled a team of young, aggressive prosecutors and investigators. He installed them in a secure office at 14 Wall Street, implemented unprecedented security measures, and began the painstaking work of building his case. His team interviewed hundreds of witnesses, many of whom were terrified of Schultz. They promised protection, offered immunity for testimony, and slowly assembled a picture of Schultz's entire operation. For Dutch, Dewey's appointment was an existential threat. Dutch had been indicted before. In 1933, he had been charged with tax evasion, similar to the charge that had finally brought down Al Capone. Dutch had fled New York, hiding out for months before finally surrendering. Through a combination of legal maneuvering, changing venues, and jury manipulation, he had beaten the charges. His lawyers portrayed him as a simple businessman, being persecuted by an overzealous government. Incredibly, it had worked. But Dewey was different. He was too honest to be bribed, too careful to be outmaneuvered, and too ambitious to be intimidated. Dutch recognized immediately that conventional defenses wouldn't work. Dewey would keep coming, keep building cases, keep applying pressure until something stuck. The prosecutor had essentially unlimited resources, the full support of the governor, and the determination of someone building a political career on gangster prosecutions. Dutch's paranoia, always present, intensified. He began seeing the investigation everywhere. When his accountant was subpoenaed, Dutch assumed betrayal. When a numbers runner was arrested, Dutch worried about what the man might say. He attended meetings with his lawyers and emerged more agitated than before, convinced that Dewey had sources inside his organization. He wasn't entirely wrong. Dewey's investigators were systematically working through Schultz's operation, finding weak links, applying pressure, offering deals. A runner arrested for assault might trade testimony for reduced charges. A controller facing prison might describe the organization's structure. A banker threatened with decades in prison might reveal financial records. Piece by piece, Dewey's case was coming together. Dutch's response was characteristically direct. He would kill everyone who might testify. Throughout 1935, witnesses disappeared. Some fled New York entirely, terrified of Schultz's reach. Others were found dead in alleys, rivers, or vacant lots. One potential witness, Jules Martin, was shot in his apartment in front of his family. The message was clear: cooperate with Dewey and die. But intimidating witnesses only reinforced Dewey's determination. He increased security for his witnesses, moved them to safe locations, and continued building his case. Every murdered witness became evidence of Schultz's dangerousness, justification for even more aggressive prosecution. The strategy of violence that had always worked for Dutch was now creating more problems than it solved. By September 1935, Dutch was facing multiple indictments. Dewey had grand juries examining his numbers racket, his tax returns, his extortion operations, and his bootlegging businesses. The walls were closing in from every direction. Dutch spent his days meeting with lawyers, his nights moving between safe houses, and every moment worrying about betrayal and arrest. The pressure affected his judgment. He became more erratic, more violent, more convinced that only extreme action could save him. His organization, sensing instability, began fracturing. Some of his most trusted men started considering their options, wondering if loyalty to Dutch Schultz was worth dying or going to prison. Bo Weinberg, his longtime enforcer, began having quiet conversations with other mob figures about possibilities for the future. Dutch called a meeting with the Syndicate bosses in September 1935. He needed their support, their resources, their help dealing with the Dewey problem. The meeting was held in a midtown hotel suite, attended by Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Lepke Buchalter, and several other major figures. Dutch laid out his situation. Dewey was destroying his organization, witnesses were cooperating, indictments were multiplying. He needed the syndicate to use their political connections to remove Dewey, to pressure the governor, to make the investigation go away. The bosses listened politely and explained that such intervention was impossible. Dewey was too high profile, too well protected politically. Any obvious attempt to interfere with his investigation would backfire catastrophically, bringing even more law enforcement attention. Dutch needed to accept that some prison time might be inevitable, hire the best lawyers money could buy, and prepare for a legal battle. Dutch's response was explosive. He didn't want advice about lawyers and legal strategy. He wanted Dewey gone. Not transferred, not discouraged. Dead. Kill Dewey, and the investigation would fall apart. His successor wouldn't have the same knowledge or determination. Key witnesses would disappear during the transition. The momentum would be lost. The room fell silent. Everyone present understood that Dutch had just proposed something unprecedented and insane. The murder of a high-ranking law enforcement official conducting a highly publicized investigation. It wasn't just wrong strategically, it was suicidal for the entire organization. The bosses tried reasoning with him. They explained the consequences. A murdered prosecutor would bring federal law enforcement down on every criminal operation in America. The FBI, which had largely stayed out of local organized crime, would become involved. The public outcry would force politicians to crack down on all mob activities, not just Schultz's. Every deal, every bribe, every arrangement they had carefully constructed would be endangered. The entire criminal underworld would suffer for Dutch's personal problem. Dutch didn't care. His empire was collapsing. He was facing decades in prison. Dewey was the cause of his destruction, and therefore, Dewey had to die. Everything else was irrelevant. The meeting ended with no agreement, and Dutch Schultz more isolated than ever before. He left convinced that the other bosses were too timid, too willing to accept the government's persecution. He would handle the Dewey problem himself. September 1935. A midtown Manhattan apartment. Dutch Schultz spread several photographs across a table. Thomas Dewey leaving his office, Dewey entering his apartment building, Dewey walking his dog in Central Park. For 2 weeks, Dutch's men had followed the prosecutor everywhere, documenting his routine, identifying vulnerabilities, looking for the perfect opportunity. Dutch studied the images with the intensity of a man whose life depended on what he saw. Because it did. Dewey lived at 1148 Fifth Avenue, a respectable building with a doorman. He maintained a consistent schedule, leaving for his office at 14 Wall Street around 8 o'clock each morning, returning between 7 and 9 each evening. He walked his dog daily, usually in the early morning. He traveled by car with a driver but without obvious security, reflecting either confidence or naivete about the men he was investigating. Dutch's plan was relatively simple. A two-man hit team would wait outside Dewey's apartment building in the early morning, concealed in a storefront or vehicle. When Dewey emerged to walk his dog, the team would approach quickly, fire multiple shots at close range, and escape in a waiting vehicle. The timing was crucial. Early morning meant fewer witnesses, and the dog-walking routine provided a predictable window. The entire operation would take less than 30 seconds. Dutch recruited his team carefully. The primary shooters would be experienced killers who could handle the pressure of such a high-profile target. One name mentioned in later testimony was Albert Anastasia, a ruthless enforcer who worked for the Syndicate and had carried out dozens of murders. But most historians now believe Anastasia refused the assignment, recognizing its insanity. Dutch eventually settled on men from his own crew, criminals willing to follow his orders without understanding the larger implications. The getaway vehicle was essential. Dutch arranged for a stolen car to be parked nearby, engine running, driver ready. The car would have false license plates and would be abandoned in New Jersey after the hit, likely set on fire to destroy evidence. The shooters would change clothes during the escape, discarding the garments they wore during the murder. They would split up, taking different routes to separate safe houses Dutch had prepared. Weapons posed a challenge. The hit needed to be quick and definitive, which meant close-range shooting with reliable firearms. Dutch obtained 2 revolvers, common weapons that couldn't be traced to any specific purchase. The guns would be loaded with jacketed hollow-point ammunition designed to cause maximum damage, ensuring Dewey wouldn't survive long enough to identify his attackers. The timing was set for late September or early October 1935. Dutch was pushing for speed, aware that every day brought Dewey closer to indictments. His men expressed concerns about rushing such a significant operation, but Dutch's paranoia and desperation overwhelmed caution. He had convinced himself that killing Dewey would solve his problems, that the investigation would collapse without its leader, that the syndicate bosses would eventually understand his decision once they saw the results. But secrecy proved impossible. Dutch's organization was too large, too interconnected with the broader criminal world. His surveillance of Dewey required multiple men, and those men talked to associates, who mentioned it to other criminals, who eventually passed word to the syndicate bosses. The intelligence network that allowed organized crime to function also ensured that major operations couldn't remain secret. Lucky Luciano learned about Dutch's plans within days. His sources described the surveillance, the recruited shooters, the planned timing. Luciano immediately called an emergency meeting of the syndicate leadership. The group gathered in a hotel suite in Midtown Manhattan, the same location where Dutch had first proposed killing Dewey, though this time without his presence. The discussion was brief and decisive. Dutch Schultz represented an existential threat to organized crime. If he killed Dewey, the resulting law enforcement response would destroy years of careful work. Every mob operation would face increased scrutiny. Every bribed official would face pressure to prove their integrity by cracking down on criminals. Every arrangement allowing the syndicate to function would be endangered, and all of this would happen because one gangster couldn't accept the consequences of his own actions. Meyer Lansky, typically cautious about violence, argued that Dutch had left them no choice. They had tried reasoning with him, tried explaining the consequences, tried bringing him into the fold of cooperative organized crime. He had rejected every approach. Now he was about to commit an act that would harm every criminal in America because he couldn't handle one prosecutor. Frank Costello, who maintained extensive political connections, confirmed that killing Dewey would be catastrophic. His sources in law enforcement and politics indicated that such a murder would trigger unprecedented response. The FBI would get involved, which meant federal resources, federal jurisdiction, and federal prosecutors who couldn't be bribed as easily as local officials. Every politician who had looked the other way or accepted bribes would face pressure to demonstrate their commitment to fighting organized crime. The entire structure would collapse. Lepke Buchhalter, who ran Murder Inc., ordered the syndicate's enforcement arm, was asked whether he could carry out a hit on Dewey. He reportedly replied that yes, he could kill Dewey, but that doing so would be organizational suicide. The question wasn't capability but wisdom, and killing Dewey would be the stupidest thing the mob could do. The conversation turned to Dutch himself. Could they control him? No. They had tried. Could they reason with him? No. He was beyond rational discussion. Could they warn him more explicitly about consequences? They had, and he hadn't cared. Every option except one had been exhausted. Vito Genovese, representing the more traditional mafia approach to organizational problems, stated what everyone knew. Dutch had become a threat to the entire enterprise. In any organization, criminal or legitimate, threats to organizational survival had to be eliminated. Dutch Schultz had proven he would prioritize his personal vendetta over collective interests. Therefore, Dutch Schultz had to die. The vote was unanimous. The syndicate would sanction a hit on Dutch Schultz. The order would go out immediately, before Dutch could move against Dewey. The execution would be carried out by trusted men, not affiliated with Dutch's organization, who would ensure the job was done properly. There would be no warnings, no negotiations, no opportunities for Dutch to talk his way out. The decision was final. Lepke Buchhalter accepted responsibility for organizing the hit. His organization had the resources, the experienced killers, and the discipline to carry out such a significant operation. He began immediately, identifying potential executioners, gathering intelligence on Dutch's movements, and planning the logistics of murdering one of the most paranoid and well-protected gangsters in New York. Meanwhile, Dutch continued planning Dewey's assassination, unaware that his own death had just been ordered. He moved between safe houses, met with his shooters to review the plan, and waited for the right moment to strike. His men noticed his increased agitation, his rambling conversations about betrayal and loyalty, his obsessive focus on Dewey. Some quietly wondered if Dutch was losing his mind, if the pressure had broken something fundamental in him. Bo Weinberg, Dutch's longtime enforcer and closest associate, had already made his decision. Weinberg had been with Dutch for years, had killed for him, had helped build the empire. But he recognized what Dutch couldn't or wouldn't, that this path led to destruction. Weinberg began having quiet conversations with other mob figures, particularly with Lucky Luciano, about a future after Dutch Schultz. Dutch suspected something but couldn't pinpoint the source of his unease. He trusted no one completely, yet his operation required delegation and trust. He needed people to carry out his orders, but every person was a potential betrayer. His paranoia, always present, had metastasized into something approaching psychosis. He saw conspiracies everywhere, treachery in every conversation, danger in every shadow. On October 23, 1935, Dutch spent the day moving between locations, meeting with lawyers, reviewing his finances, and preparing for the Dewey hit. He planned to move forward within days, convinced that once Dewey was dead, his troubles would end, the investigation would collapse, witnesses would disappear, and he could rebuild his empire without interference. It was a fantasy, but Dutch had fully committed to it. That evening, he decided to eat dinner at the Palace Chophouse in Newark, New Jersey. It was one of his regular spots, a restaurant he trusted, where he felt safe. He brought 3 bodyguards, Bernard Lulu Rosenkrantz, Abe Landau, and Otto Abadaba Berman. Berman was his accountant, the financial genius who managed the numbers racket's complex calculations and payoffs. They settled into a back room, ordering food and drinks. Dutch relaxed slightly, feeling the tension of the day ease. Outside, 3 men emerged from a black sedan, walking purposefully toward the restaurant entrance. They had been waiting for this moment, had tracked Dutch's movements, had finally found him in a location vulnerable enough for the hit. The executioners were Charles the Bug Workman and Emmanuel Mendiweiss, 2 of Murder Inc.'s most experienced killers. Both men had carried out dozens of hits for the Syndicate, had proven their reliability and nerve. They entered the Palace Chophouse at approximately 10:15 p.m., weapons concealed, prepared to carry out the Syndicate's judgment on Dutch Schultz. The National Crime Syndicate emerged from the ashes of the Castellammares War, the bloody conflict that had torn through New York's Italian organized crime families in the early 1930s. The old bosses, Joe Masseria, Salvatore Maranzano, had fought over territory and tradition, demanding absolute loyalty to old-world hierarchies and Sicilian customs. The war had killed dozens of men and brought excessive law enforcement attention. Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky recognized that such conflicts were obsolete, that the future of organized crime required cooperation, not warfare. Luciano orchestrated Masseria's murder in April 1931, then arranged Maranzano's assassination in September of the same year. These weren't simple power grabs. They were revolutionary acts that destroyed the old mafia structure and replaced it with something new. Instead of a single boss demanding tribute and obedience, the Syndicate would operate as a federation of equals. Major decisions would be made collectively. Disputes would be arbitrated rather than fought. Most importantly, members would understand that organizational interests superseded personal interests. Meyer Lansky, though Jewish, and therefore unable to become a made man in the Italian mafia, was Luciano's most trusted advisor and the Syndicate's financial architect. Lansky understood what most gangsters didn't, that the real money came from careful management, legitimate business fronts, and strategic political corruption. He established protocols for money laundering, created shell companies to hide criminal proceeds, and built relationships with corrupt politicians and police officials across multiple states. Frank Costello, known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld, managed the Syndicate's political connections. He cultivated relationships with Tammany Hall politicians, judges, and police commanders. His ability to fix cases, influence elections, and arrange favorable treatment for Syndicate members was legendary. Costello understood that power in the criminal world ultimately came from connections to the legitimate world, and he spent enormous sums maintaining those connections. Lepke Buchalter ran Murder Inc., the enforcement arm that carried out hits for the entire syndicate. Based in Brooklyn, Murder Inc. employed dozens of professional killers who would execute anyone marked for death by the syndicate leadership. The organization maintained strict discipline. Killers didn't know why targets were marked, didn't question orders, and didn't leave survivors. Murder Inc. transformed assassination from chaotic gang warfare into a business function, carried out with the efficiency of any corporate service. Vito Genovese represented the more traditional mafia families, but had embraced the syndicate structure. He understood that cooperation was more profitable than conflict, and that the old ways of endless territorial disputes had nearly destroyed organized crime entirely. Genovese was brutal, paranoid, and ambitious, but he accepted the syndicate's authority because it provided stability and profit. These men, Luciano, Lansky, Costello, Buchalter, Genovese, and several others, constituted the syndicate's leadership. They met regularly, discussed major operations, resolved disputes, and made strategic decisions affecting criminal operations across the United States. They had connections to organized crime groups in other cities: Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Kansas City, Los Angeles. They were building a national criminal network, standardizing operations, sharing intelligence, and cooperating on major ventures. Dutch Schultz had been a peripheral member of this structure. He attended important meetings, contributed intelligence when asked, and generally operated within his territory without excessive conflict. But he had always been an uncomfortable fit. His temperament was wrong, too violent, too impulsive, too focused on personal power rather than organizational interests. The other bosses tolerated him because his operations were profitable and largely self-contained, but they watched him carefully. When rumors first reached Luciano that Dutch was planning to kill Thomas Dewey, his initial reaction was disbelief. No gangster was that stupid. Killing a regular prosecutor would bring heat. Killing a high-profile special prosecutor would bring catastrophe. Surely Dutch understood that. Surely he was just venting frustration, not actually planning murder. But Luciano's intelligence network brought more information: surveillance of Dewey, recruitment of shooters, discussions about timing and logistics. Dutch wasn't just talking. He was actually planning to kill a United States attorney, conducting a highly publicized investigation into organized crime. The insanity of it was staggering. Luciano called Frank Costello first. Costello's political connections made him the best source for understanding potential consequences. Costello confirmed Luciano's fears. Killing Dewey would be absolutely catastrophic. Every politician who had taken mob money, every cop who had looked the other way, every judge who had fixed a case, all of them would face enormous pressure to demonstrate their integrity by crushing organized crime. The public outcry would be massive. The federal government would get involved. Every criminal operation in the country would suffer. Meyer Lansky, when consulted, ran through the financial implications. Investigations would freeze bank accounts, seize assets, and destroy the careful corporate structures he had built to launder money. Operations would be forced underground, becoming less efficient and less profitable. Bribes would have to increase dramatically as officials faced more scrutiny. The cost of business would skyrocket while revenue plummeted. Financially, killing Dewey would be devastating. The syndicate bosses convened an emergency meeting in late September 1935. The gathering took place in a suite at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in Manhattan, chosen for its security and relative anonymity. Luciano, Lansky, Costello, Buchalter, Genovese, and several other major figures gathered to discuss what everyone now recognized as a crisis. Luciano opened the meeting by laying out the situation. Dutch Schultz was actively planning to assassinate Thomas Dewey. The surveillance was ongoing. The shooters were recruited. The timing was being finalized. This wasn't speculation or rumor anymore. Multiple independent sources confirmed the plan. The question facing the syndicate was what to do about it. The initial discussion focused on whether they could stop Dutch through negotiation. Costello suggested bringing Dutch to another meeting, explaining the consequences in even more explicit terms, perhaps offering to use political connections to slow down Dewey's investigation. Lansky proposed offering Dutch financial support for a legal defense, arguing that even if Dutch went to prison for a few years, he could maintain control of his operations through intermediaries. But others in the room recognized that such approaches had already failed. They had already warned Dutch about the consequences. He didn't care. They had already tried reasoning with him. He was beyond reason. His paranoia and desperation had pushed him past the point where rational argument could work. Dutch believed killing Dewey was his only option, and nothing short of physical force would stop him. Lepke Buchhalter, the enforcer, spoke plainly. In his experience running Murder Inc., when someone became a threat to the organization that couldn't be controlled through other means, there was only one solution. Organizations survived by eliminating threats, and Dutch Schultz had become an existential threat. Every day he remained alive increased the risk that he would kill Dewey and bring destruction down on all of them. The discussion turned uncomfortable. These men had worked with Dutch for years. They had attended meetings together, split profits together, solved problems together. Now they were discussing his murder with the detachment of businessmen discussing a failing investment. But that was exactly what the situation required: the ability to separate personal feelings from organizational necessity. Genovese raised the question of loyalty and precedent. If they killed Dutch for defying syndicate orders, what message did that send? Would other independent operators become more fearful, less willing to cooperate? Would it create more instability than it prevented? Luciano's response was measured but firm. The syndicate wasn't killing Dutch for general defiance or independence. They were killing him for planning an action that would harm everyone in organized crime. This wasn't about enforcing arbitrary rules. It was about organizational survival. Any member, regardless of how powerful or profitable, who threatened the entire structure had to be removed. That was the precedent they needed to establish. The question of timing arose. Should they wait to see if Dutch actually moved against Dewey, or act preemptively? Waiting meant maintaining certainty about Dutch's intentions, but risked him actually killing Dewey before they could stop him. Acting immediately meant potentially killing a man who might have changed his mind, but eliminated the risk of catastrophe. Lansky argued for immediate action. Every day they waited was another day Dutch might move against Dewey. The intelligence indicated Dutch was planning to act soon, possibly within days. They couldn't afford to wait for confirmation that would only come after Dewey was already dead. Prevention was the only acceptable strategy. The vote was called. Each man present was asked whether Dutch Schultz should be killed. One by one, they agreed. Luciano voted yes. Lansky voted yes. Costello, despite his usual preference for negotiation, voted yes. Buchhalter voted yes. Genovese voted yes. The decision was unanimous and final. Dutch Schultz had to die. Buchhalter accepted responsibility for organizing the hit. His Murder Inc. operation had the expertise and resources necessary. He would select the killers, gather intelligence on Dutch's movements, and choose the optimal time and location. The operation would be carried out professionally, quickly, and definitively. There would be no mistakes, no survivors, no loose ends. The meeting concluded with a discussion of the aftermath. Once Dutch was dead, his organization would need to be absorbed peacefully. His numbers operations, particularly the Harlem racket, were too profitable to abandon. The syndicate would move quickly to take control, installing new management that would operate within syndicate guidelines. Bo Weinberg, Dutch's chief enforcer, had already been approached about cooperation. After Dutch's death, Weinberg would help facilitate the transition in exchange for a position in the new structure. The bosses dispersed from the Waldorf Astoria suite, each returning to their own operations. The decision had been made. The machinery of execution was now in motion. Dutch Schultz had perhaps days or weeks to live, though he didn't know it yet. Luciano later reflected on the decision with mixed feelings. He hadn't enjoyed ordering the death of a fellow gangster, especially one who had been a profitable operator. But leadership required making difficult decisions, and allowing Dutch to kill Dewey would have been organizational suicide. The syndicate existed to prevent exactly this kind of individual recklessness from destroying the whole criminal enterprise. Dutch's death would reinforce that principle. No one, regardless of their power or profits, was more important than the organization's survival. Meanwhile, Dutch's isolation deepened. His closest associates sensed the danger, even if they didn't know about the Syndicate's decision. Bo Weinberg, who had spent years as Dutch's most trusted enforcer, was already positioning himself for the inevitable transition. Weinberg had seen enough of Dutch's erratic behavior to recognize that the end was approaching. When Luciano's emissaries approached him about the post-Schultz future, Weinberg was receptive. He provided information about Dutch's schedule, his safe houses, his security routines. It was the ultimate betrayal, but Weinberg understood the calculation. Dutch was finished whether Weinberg helped or not. The Syndicate's decision was final, and they had the resources to carry it out regardless of Weinberg's cooperation. By helping, Weinberg ensured his own survival and potentially prospered in the new structure. By refusing, he would have died alongside Dutch as an obstacle to be removed. The choice was simple. Other members of Dutch's organization sensed the shift. Accountants began quietly copying financial records, preparing to hand them over to new management. Controllers in the numbers racket started taking meetings with syndicate representatives. Everyone wanted to ensure they would survive the transition when Dutch inevitably fell. Dutch himself seemed oblivious to the conspiracy tightening around him. His focus remained fixed on Thomas Dewey. He spent his days refining the assassination plan, moving money to secure locations, and preparing for what he imagined would be his triumphant escape from prosecution. He believed that once Dewey was dead, his problems would end. The investigation would collapse. His empire would be safe. He would have won. The disconnect between Dutch's perception and reality was complete. He saw himself as a gangster defending his empire against government persecution. The Syndicate saw him as a liability threatening everyone's survival. He believed he was fighting for his life. They believed they were protecting the organization from his recklessness. Both perspectives were true, but only one would prevail. On October 15, 1935, Lepke Buchalter met with Charles the Bug Workman and Emmanuel Mendy Weiss, two of Murder Inc.'s most reliable killers. Workman was a slight, nervous man whose appearance belied his efficiency as an assassin. Weiss was stockier, more physically intimidating, equally deadly. Together they had carried out dozens of hits for the Syndicate, always completing assignments without complications. Buchalter gave them their target, Dutch Schultz. He provided photographs, described Dutch's security arrangements, and explained the urgency. The hit needed to happen soon, before Dutch could move against Dewey. Workman and Weiss began their surveillance immediately, tracking Dutch's movements, identifying patterns, looking for opportunities. Dutch made their job easier by maintaining regular routines despite the danger surrounding him. He visited the same restaurants, stayed at predictable safe houses, and moved through Newark and New York with a small security detail. His paranoia manifested in constant vigilance, but didn't translate into unpredictable behavior. He was cautious, but habitual, which gave his assassins patterns to exploit. The surveillance continued for several days. Workman and Weiss followed Dutch from location to location, noting his bodyguards, timing his movements, identifying vulnerable moments. They reported back to Buchalter regularly, refining their plan as they gathered more intelligence. The Palace Chophouse in Newark became a focal point. Dutch ate there regularly, often in the back room with his closest associates. The restaurant was familiar territory, which made Dutch relaxed. The backroom location meant fewer witnesses. The predictability of his visits meant Workman and Weiss could prepare in advance. On October 23, 1935, intelligence indicated that Dutch planned to eat dinner at the Palace Chophouse that evening. Workman and Weiss positioned themselves nearby, watching the entrance, waiting for Dutch to arrive. At approximately 10 p.m., Dutch's car pulled up. He emerged with three men, Bernard Lulu Rosenkrantz, Abe Landau, and Otto Abadaba Berman. The four entered the restaurant and settled into the back room. Workman and Weiss waited 15 minutes, allowing Dutch and his men to relax, to lower their guard, to focus on their meal rather than security. At 10:15 p.m., they entered the Palace Chophouse, weapons concealed but ready. The restaurant's front room held a few customers eating dinner, unaware of what was about to happen. Workman and Weiss moved quickly past them toward the back room where Dutch was dining. The moment had arrived. The Syndicate's judgment was about to be executed. Dutch Schultz, the gangster who believed he could defy the mob, who thought killing a prosecutor was acceptable, who put his personal vendetta above organizational interests, had run out of time. 10:15 p.m., Palace Chophouse, Newark. Charles Workman pushed through the door to the back room, his revolver already drawn. The scene before him was almost domestic. 4 men around a table, food and drinks scattered across the surface, conversation in progress. Bernard Rosenkrantz sat closest to the door. Abe Landau was to his right. Otto Berman sat across from them. Dutch Schultz's chair was empty. He had stepped away to use the bathroom. Workman didn't hesitate. He opened fire immediately. The first shot hit Rosenkrantz in the chest, the impact slamming him backward. Landau reached for his weapon, but Workman's second and third shots caught him in the torso. Emanuel Weiss entered behind Workman, firing at Berman, who had risen from his chair and was attempting to flee. The back room filled with smoke, noise, and chaos. Rosenkrantz, despite his wounds, managed to draw his own gun. Bleeding heavily, operating on pure adrenaline, he returned fire at Workman and Weiss. His shots went wild, but they forced the assassins to take cover. Landau, also mortally wounded, fired several rounds before collapsing. The intended quiet execution had become a gunfight. Workman, realizing Dutch wasn't in the main room, moved toward the bathroom. He kicked open the door and found Dutch standing at the urinal. Dutch turned, reaching for his weapon, but Workman fired first. The bullet entered Dutch's torso, the angle suggesting he had been turning when shot. Dutch collapsed against the bathroom wall, sliding to the floor, his hand still reaching for the gun he never drew. In the main room, Weiss had finished off Berman with additional shots. The accountant lay dead near the back table, his blood pooling on the restaurant floor. Rosenkrantz and Landau were both down but still alive, gasping for breath, their weapons finally silent. Workman and Weiss fled through the restaurant's front entrance, past terrified customers who had ducked under tables at the first sounds of gunfire. They climbed into their waiting vehicle and sped away into the Newark night. The entire assault had lasted less than 2 minutes. 4 men had been shot, the back room was destroyed, and Dutch Schultz was dying on a bathroom floor. Police arrived within minutes, responding to reports of shots fired. They found a scene of carnage. Berman was dead. Rosenkrantz and Landau were critically wounded but conscious. And Dutch Schultz was slumped in the bathroom, bleeding from a gunshot wound to his abdomen, still alive, but fading. Ambulances rushed the survivors to Newark City Hospital. Rosenkrantz died en route. Landau survived the trip but died in the emergency room hours later. Dutch, unconscious, was taken into surgery. The bullet had perforated his intestines and caused massive internal damage. Doctors worked for hours trying to stabilize him, but peritonitis, infection from the ruptured intestines, was already setting in. Without modern antibiotics, such injuries were almost always fatal. Dutch regained consciousness the following day, October 24th. Police detectives immediately attempted to interview him, desperate for information about who had shot him and why. But Dutch was delirious with fever and pain. His statements, recorded by a police stenographer, became famous for their surreal, rambling quality, a gangster's fever dream captured on paper. The transcript captures a mind unraveling. A boy has never wept, nor dashed 1,000 kim. You can play jacks, and girls do that with a soft ball and do tricks with it. Oh, dog biscuit, and when he is happy he doesn't get snappy. Mixed into the delirium were fragments of coherent thought. He mentioned his mother, his wife, his money. He talked about hidden assets, about betrayal, about people who owed him money. Detectives tried to steer him toward identifying his shooters, but Dutch's mind wandered through fever and memory without focus. His wife Frances was brought to his bedside. Dutch briefly recognized her, spoke a few coherent words about their home and possessions, then slipped back into delirium. Frances, who had married the gangster knowing his dangerous life, now watched him die slowly, his mind already gone even as his body fought to survive. By October 25th, Dutch's condition had deteriorated further. The infection had spread throughout his abdomen. His fever spiked higher. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid for moments before returning to incomprehensible rambling. Police maintained a presence at his bedside, still hoping for useful testimony, but Dutch never identified his attackers. At 8:35 p.m. on October 24, 1935, Dutch Schultz died. The official cause was peritonitis secondary to a gunshot wound. He was 33 years old. His criminal empire, built over 15 years through violence and intimidation, had ended on a bathroom floor in Newark. The man who had thought he could kill a prosecutor and survive, who had defied the Syndicate's orders, who had believed himself untouchable, was dead before he could carry out his suicidal plan. The news spread quickly through New York's criminal underworld. Dutch Schultz was dead. The beer baron of the Bronx, the policy king of Harlem, the gangster who had built an empire worth millions, had been murdered in a routine hit at a third-rate restaurant. The message was clear. The Syndicate's power superseded any individual gangster's ambitions. Defiance brought death, regardless of how wealthy or well-connected you were. Thomas Dewey, the prosecutor Dutch had planned to kill, learned of the assassination within hours. His reaction was complex. On one hand, a major target of his investigation was dead, which closed certain cases but also eliminated a potential source of testimony about other criminals. On the other hand, the murder demonstrated the ruthlessness of the criminal organizations he was investigating. If gangsters would kill one of their own this efficiently, what would they do to anyone who opposed them? Dewey released a brief statement. Schultz was a public enemy and a yellow rat. As a result of his career, dozens of people are dead. His death is the end of a vicious criminal career and no loss to society. Privately, Dewey recognized that Schultz's death had likely saved his own life. Intelligence sources later confirmed that Dutch had been days away from ordering the hit on Dewey when the Syndicate intervened. The funeral was held on October 28, 1935, at the Gate of Heaven Cemetery in Hawthorne, New York. Despite Dutch's prominence in the criminal world, attendance was sparse. The major mob bosses stayed away, not wanting to be photographed or associated with a gangster who had died for defying Syndicate orders. A few family members attended, along with several lower-level criminals who either hadn't received the message or chose to pay respects anyway. Frances Schultz, his widow, attended dressed in black, maintaining dignity despite the circumstances. She inherited nothing directly. Dutch's assets had been hidden in various locations, buried or stashed in safe deposit boxes, protected from both law enforcement and potential rivals. Some of that money was eventually recovered, but much of it remains missing to this day, the subject of treasure hunter speculation and mythology. The investigation into Dutch's murder moved slowly. Police knew it was a mob hit but struggled to identify the specific killers or their motives. Witnesses from the Palace Chophouse provided vague descriptions of the shooters, but couldn't make definitive identifications. The getaway car was found burned in New Jersey, all evidence destroyed. No murder weapon was recovered. The case remained officially open, but effectively unsolved. Behind the scenes, the Syndicate moved immediately to absorb Dutch's operations. Bo Weinberg, who had provided intelligence for the hit, was approached about managing the transition. The Syndicate offered him a position overseeing the Harlem numbers racket, maintaining continuity while ensuring the operation now answered to Syndicate leadership, rather than an independent operator. But Weinberg's cooperation had made him valuable, which also made him dangerous. He knew too much about how the Syndicate operated, about who had ordered Dutch's death, about the mechanics of high-level mob politics. In September 1935, just weeks after Dutch's death, Weinberg disappeared. His body was never found, but mob informants later confirmed he had been killed and disposed of at sea, wearing concrete overshoes, the classic mafia method of permanent disposal. The message was clear. The Syndicate rewarded cooperation, but that reward was temporary. Everyone was expendable. Weinberg had betrayed Dutch, helped facilitate his murder, and then been eliminated because he knew too much. It was a reminder that in the criminal underworld, today's ally could become tomorrow's liability in an instant. Dutch's numbers operations were systematically taken over by Syndicate-affiliated operators. The Harlem racket continued functioning without interruption. The runners still collected bets. The controllers still processed payments. The bankers still managed the money. Only the people at the top changed. The Syndicate installed reliable managers who understood that profits would now be shared according to Syndicate rules, rather than flowing to an independent operator. The speakeasies and bootlegging operations were similarly absorbed. With Prohibition ending in 1933, the alcohol business was transitioning to legitimate distribution anyway. But Dutch's established networks and political connections remained valuable. The syndicate took control of these assets, integrating them into their broader criminal enterprises. The financial implications of Dutch's death were significant. His empire had generated an estimated $20 million annually. That revenue now flowed to syndicate operations, increasing their wealth and power. The Harlem numbers racket alone produced millions in cash that could be used to fund other operations, bribe officials, and expand into new territories. But beyond the money, Dutch's death established a precedent. The syndicate had proven it would kill its own members when organizational interests required it. No gangster, regardless of their wealth or power, could defy collective decisions without consequences. The era of independent operators like Dutch Schultz, who built personal empires and answered to no one, was ending. The future belonged to the syndicate, organized, hierarchical, ruthless in enforcing discipline. Lucky Luciano later discussed Dutch's death in conversations with associates. He expressed no regret about ordering the hit, but acknowledged that Dutch had been a talented criminal operator whose ambition had exceeded his wisdom. If Dutch had accepted his role within the larger organization, if he had consulted with the syndicate before planning to kill Dewey, if he had understood that individual actions had collective consequences, he might have lived. But Dutch's fundamental nature, impulsive, violent, convinced of his own exceptional status, made him incompatible with organized crime's evolution toward corporate structure. Meyer Lansky viewed Dutch's death as a necessary business decision. He later told associates that killing Dutch was like closing a failing division of a company. The operation was producing revenue, but creating risk that outweighed the profits. The logical business decision was to eliminate the risk, absorb the profitable elements, and move forward. Sentiment had no place in such calculations. In the months following Dutch's death, law enforcement noticed a shift in organized crime's behavior. Violence decreased. High-profile crimes became less frequent. The syndicate was consolidating power, focusing on sustainable operations rather than attention-grabbing robberies or murders. Thomas Dewey's investigation continued, but without Dutch's impulsive recklessness providing opportunities for prosecution. The criminal underworld had become more disciplined, more careful, and therefore harder to penetrate. Dutch Schultz's death marked a turning point in American organized crime. He represented the last generation of independent mob operators, gangsters who built personal empires through charisma, violence, and force of will. The future belonged to a different model, the syndicate's corporate structure, where individual ambition was subordinated to organizational interests and where decisions were made collectively rather than by individual bosses. His fundamental mistake was strategic rather than tactical. The plan to kill Thomas Dewey wasn't poorly conceived from a technical perspective. The surveillance was thorough, the timing was reasonable, the execution would likely have succeeded. The mistake was failing to understand that some actions, regardless of their tactical merit, create consequences that outweigh any benefits. Killing a prosecutor might have temporarily stopped one investigation, but it would have triggered a response that would have destroyed organized crime in America. Dutch's inability to think beyond his immediate interests reflected a cognitive limitation that ultimately proved fatal. He could plan complex criminal operations, manage large organizations, and outmaneuver rivals in street-level conflicts, but he couldn't conceptualize the broader ecosystem in which he operated. He didn't understand that his actions would affect every other criminal in America, that killing Dewey would bring federal law enforcement into a fight that had previously remained primarily local, that short-term tactical victories could create long-term strategic disasters. This limitation wasn't unique to Dutch Schultz. Many criminals throughout history have demonstrated tactical brilliance while remaining strategically blind. They can execute perfect bank robberies but don't understand how each robbery increases law enforcement pressure on all criminals. They can build profitable operations but don't recognize when their success attracts attention that threatens the entire criminal ecosystem. Dutch was simply the most dramatic example of this disconnect. The syndicate bosses who ordered his death demonstrated a different kind of criminal intelligence. They understood systems, consequences, and long-term thinking. When they looked at Dutch's plan to kill Dewey, they didn't just see an assassination attempt. They saw federal investigations, congressional hearings, destroyed political connections, frozen bank accounts, and years of reduced profitability across all criminal operations. They calculated that losing Dutch's revenue was better than risking the entire structure. This represented organized crime's evolution from chaotic street gangs to sophisticated criminal enterprises. The syndicate operated more like a corporation than a gang. They had hierarchies, dispute resolution mechanisms, standardized practices, and collective decision-making. Individual bosses still ran their own operations, but they understood they were part of a larger structure that provided protection, resources, and stability in exchange for adherence to certain rules. Dutch's death reinforced the most important rule: organizational survival superseded individual interests. You could be wealthy, powerful, and successful, but if your actions threatened the collective, you would be eliminated. This wasn't personal, it was organizational maintenance. The syndicate killed Dutch the way a business fires an executive whose personal ambitions endanger the company. The impact on New York's criminal landscape was immediate and lasting. Independent operators recognized that the era of personal empires was ending. You either joined the syndicate structure and accepted their rules, or you remained small-scale and irrelevant, or you died. Most chose to join. Within a few years, virtually all major criminal operations in New York were affiliated with the syndicate in some way. Thomas Dewey's career benefited significantly from Dutch's death. He continued his investigations into organized crime, eventually securing convictions against Lucky Luciano and other major figures. His reputation as a gangbuster prosecutor launched a political career that included 3 terms as governor of New York and 2 presidential nominations. He remained convinced throughout his life that Dutch Schultz had genuinely intended to kill him, and that only the syndicate's intervention had saved his life. Dutch's story entered American popular culture as a cautionary tale about ambition and hubris. Books, movies, and television shows have portrayed him as a tragic figure, talented but flawed, successful but ultimately self-destructive. The image of the gangster who defied the mob and paid with his life became a recurring theme in crime fiction. His last words, rambling and surreal, have been analyzed by writers and psychologists as a window into a criminal mind confronting mortality. The money Dutch hid has never been fully recovered. He reportedly buried large sums in upstate New York, possibly near Phoenicia in the Catskill Mountains. Treasure hunters have searched for decades, digging up fields and forests based on cryptic clues from Dutch's deathbed statements. A few small caches have been discovered, but the bulk of his fortune, if it even exists, remains hidden. The mystery adds to the mythology, the idea that Dutch Schultz's legacy includes literal buried treasure waiting to be found. But the real legacy isn't hidden money or popular culture portrayals. Dutch Schultz's significance lies in what his death represented: the triumph of organizational discipline over individual ambition in American organized crime. Before Dutch, gangsters like Al Capone and Bugs Moran had operated as independent operators, building personal empires and fighting territorial wars that brought excessive law enforcement attention. After Dutch, the syndicate's model dominated. Cooperation replaced competition. Negotiation replaced warfare. Corporate thinking replaced gangster mentality. This evolution made organized crime more efficient and more durable. The syndicate structure survived for decades, adapting to changing circumstances, managing law enforcement pressure, and continuing to generate enormous profits. Individual bosses were arrested or killed, but the organization persisted. Dutch's death was an early lesson in how that system would function. Violate organizational rules, and you would be removed, regardless of who you were. Modern criminal organizations still follow similar principles. Drug cartels, terrorist networks, and sophisticated criminal enterprises operate with hierarchical structures, collective decision-making, and enforcement mechanisms for maintaining discipline. The fundamental insight that Dutch Schultz died for, that organizational interests must supersede individual ambitions, remains central to how criminal groups function. From a purely analytical perspective, Dutch Schultz made a series of choices that led inevitably to his death. He could have accepted that some criminal prosecutions were unavoidable and prepared a legal defense. He could have consulted with the syndicate before planning to kill Dewey. He could have recognized that his personal survival was less important than the organization's stability. Each of these alternative choices might have saved his life. but making those choices would have required being a different person. Dutch's entire criminal career had been built on refusing to accept limits, on using violence to solve problems, on believing that his will could overcome any obstacle. Asking him to suddenly become cautious and cooperative was asking him to abandon the very qualities that had made him successful. His greatest strengths, ambition, fearlessness, willingness to use extreme violence, were inseparable from the weakness that killed him: inability to recognize when those qualities had become liabilities. October 24, 1935, 8:35 p.m. Newark City Hospital. Dutch Schultz's heart stopped beating. The gangster who had built an empire worth millions, who had controlled blocks of Harlem and the Bronx, who had survived gang wars and indictments, died in a hospital bed surrounded by police officers hoping for a confession. His last coherent thoughts, whatever they were, remained locked in a mind destroyed by fever and trauma. His empire, which had seemed so permanent just weeks earlier, was already being divided among the men who had ordered his death. The arc of Dutch Schultz's life traced the evolution of American organized crime from chaotic violence to structured discipline. He rose during the era when individual gangsters could build personal empires through ruthlessness and ambition. He died at the moment when that era ended, when organized crime transformed into something more sophisticated and sustainable. His murder wasn't just the elimination of one troublesome gangster, it was organized crime's declaration that the future belonged to organizations, not individuals. The parallels between Dutch's story and classical tragedy are striking. He was talented, ambitious, and ultimately destroyed by his fundamental character flaw, an inability to recognize limits. Like a Greek tragic hero, his greatest strength, his willingness to use violence to solve any problem, contained the seed of his destruction. When he decided to kill Thomas Dewey, he was simply doing what he had always done, identifying an obstacle and applying violence to remove it. It had worked dozens of times before. This time it triggered his death. The syndicate bosses who ordered the hit demonstrated a different kind of criminal wisdom. They understood that power in the modern world required more than guns and intimidation. It required political connections, financial sophistication, and the ability to think strategically about consequences. When they looked at Dutch's plan, they saw not just an assassination, but a chain of events that would destroy everything they had built. They chose organizational survival over individual loyalty, and that choice defined organized crime for the next several decades. Thomas Dewey survived to become one of the most famous prosecutors and politicians of his generation. He never knew how close he came to death, how Dutch's shooters had been watching his apartment, planning the hit, waiting for the order. The syndicate's decision to kill Dutch first saved Dewey's life, though he couldn't know it at the time. He continued investigating organized crime, securing major convictions, building a reputation that launched him into national politics. He ran for president twice, governed New York for 3 terms, and remained convinced throughout his life that organized crime could be defeated through aggressive prosecution. But the syndicate proved more durable than Dewey imagined. They absorbed Dutch's operations, adapted to increased law enforcement pressure, and continued generating enormous profits. Individual bosses were arrested or killed, but the organization persisted, evolving with changing times. Lucky Luciano was eventually deported. Meyer Lansky died of old age in Miami. Frank Costello was imprisoned and released. But the structure they built outlasted all of them. Dutch Schultz's buried treasure, if it exists, remains hidden somewhere in upstate New York. Treasure hunters still search, following cryptic clues from his deathbed ravings, digging holes in the Catskill Mountains. They probably won't find it. But the search itself reveals something about Dutch's legacy. He remains fascinating because he embodied the contradictions of American crime. He was brutal but successful, ambitious but self-destructive, talented but flawed. He built an empire and then destroyed it through his own recklessness. The story of Dutch Schultz isn't just about one gangster's rise and fall. It's about how organizations evolve, how individual ambition conflicts with collective interests, and how even the most powerful individuals are ultimately subject to forces larger than themselves. Dutch believed he was exceptional, that the rules constraining other criminals didn't apply to him. The syndicate taught him otherwise, in the most final way possible. Standing in the Palace Chophouse back room on October 23, 1935, Charles Workman didn't know he was executing a death sentence for organizational defiance. He was just following orders, carrying out another hit for Murder, Inc., earning his pay. But that moment, the split second when Workman pulled the trigger, marked the end of one era of organized crime and the beginning of another. The age of independent gangster kings was over. The age of criminal corporations had begun. Dutch Schultz died because he couldn't adapt to that change. He remained a street thug with an empire, a violent criminal who thought wealth and power made him invincible. He was wrong. The bullets that killed him carried a message that would echo through the criminal underworld for decades. In organized crime's new world, no one was above the organization. Not the richest, not the most ruthless, not Dutch Schultz. The cost of defying the mob was simple and absolute: your life. Dutch paid that cost in full, dying slowly from an abdominal gunshot wound, his mind destroyed by fever, his empire already stripped away and redistributed. He left behind a widow, some hidden money, and a warning to every criminal who came after him. The organization is bigger than any individual. Forget that, and you die. Newark City Hospital, October 24th, 1935. A gangster's heart stopped, an era ended, and organized crime moved forward without him, more disciplined, more structured, and more dangerous than ever before.